After Antioch, there was no celebration that lasted. There was no great sense of triumph, no feeling of safety, only exhaustion. The city had fallen, yes, but the men who stood within its walls were hollowed out by hunger, disease, and months of relentless fear. Antioch had taken more from them than it had given, and even as they buried their dead and tended to their wounds, one truth loomed over them like a shadow that never lifted. Jerusalem still lay ahead, the cost of survival. For many, Antioch should have been the end. Men had died not in glorious charges, but slowly, wasting away from hunger, coughing blood into frozen earth, succumbing to fevers that burned through their bodies like unseen fire. Armor had rusted. Horses had collapsed in the mud and never risen again. Supplies had vanished long before hope did. Some men whispered that God had already tested them enough. Others feared he was not finished. The army that emerged from Antioch was not the same army that had first marched east. It was smaller, harder, more suspicious, more desperate. Every face bore the marks of survival. Sunken eyes, cracked lips, hands that trembled from fatigue even as they gripped swords. And yet they marched on. Why they could not turn back. To turn back now would mean everything had been for nothing. Months of suffering, thousands of deaths, broken families left behind in distant lands. What would they return to? How would they explain that they had come so far, only to stop short of the city they believed God himself had placed at the end of the road? So they marched, not because they were strong, but because stopping felt worse than dying. The land changes. As the army moved south, the land itself seemed to resist them. The cool winds of Syria gave way to heat that pressed down without mercy. The earth hardened beneath their feet. Streams dried into cracked scars in the soil. Wells were guarded, poisoned, or already empty. Water became more valuable than gold. Men traded armor for a single drink. Knights, once proud and mounted, now walked barefoot beside peasants, shields slung across aching shoulders. The sun did not care who they were. It punished everyone equally. Discipline begins to crack. With hardship came tension. Old rivalries flared. Commanders argued. Soldiers deserted when they could. Some slipped away at night, hoping to survive on their own rather than die under a banner that no longer felt protective. Raymond of Toulouse struggled to hold unity among men who no longer trusted promises. Godfrey of Bouillon carried the weight of expectation silently, knowing every decision could mean life or death for thousands. Bohemond, ever pragmatic, watched morale carefully, understanding that belief alone could not move an army forever. Faith still existed, but now it competed with hunger. Small stories along the road. Along the march, quiet tragedies unfolded. A father buried his son beneath a lone tree, marking the grave with a broken spear because there was no stone. A knight, once wealthy, sold his horse, the last symbol of his status, for a few days' rations. A pilgrim collapsed in the heat and was carried for miles by strangers who did not even know his name. At night, campfires burned lower than before. Men spoke less. Some prayed in whispers. Others did not pray at all anymore. The weight of time. Days stretched endlessly. Every sunrise brought hope that faded by noon. Every sunset brought relief that came too late. Shoes fell apart. Feet blistered and bled. Armor chafed skin raw. The smell of sweat, iron, and sickness clung to the air. And still the road went on. Every hill crested revealed only more distance. Jerusalem felt less like a destination and more like a myth. Doubt enters the soul. Some began to ask questions they had never allowed themselves before. Was this truly God's will? Or had they misunderstood his silence? Had faith carried them this far? Or had it blinded them? Priests spoke louder now. Sermons grew more intense. Promises of salvation were repeated again and again, as if repetition alone could strengthen belief. But belief, once cracked, does not heal easily. The near breaking point. By early summer, the army was barely holding together. Men collapsed on the march and were left behind because there was no strength left to carry them. Arguments turned violent. Commanders feared mutiny, not because the men hated them, but because desperation had erased reason. It was said that some soldiers dreamed of water so vividly that they awoke, screaming when reality returned. Others claimed to see signs in the sky. Not all signs were comforting. Then Jerusalem appears, and then, one morning, the road crested a final rise. The army slowed. Men stopped walking. Some fell to their knees. There on the horizon stood Jerusalem, not imagined, not promised, but real, stone walls glowing under the sun, towers rising above ancient ground. The city that had lived in sermons, prayers, and dreams now stood before them. Men wept openly. Some laughed. Some kissed the earth. Some stood silent, afraid to believe it was real. They had arrived. The truth reveals itself, but joy lasted only moments. As eyes adjusted, reality settled in. The walls were strong. The city was prepared. The land around it was dry and unforgiving, and the army that stood before Jerusalem was starving, exhausted, and fractured. They had reached the holy city, and now they realized they might die beneath its walls. The road had not ended their suffering. It had delivered them to its final test. Jerusalem waited, silent, unyielding, eternal, and the men who stood before it knew, deep within their bones, that whatever happened next would define them forever. Jerusalem did not greet them with silence. It greeted them with weight. The moment the army stopped before its walls, the air itself seemed heavier, as if the city were watching them, measuring them, judging whether they were worthy to stand upon the ground that so many generations had fought over before. This was no ordinary fortress. Jerusalem was ancient even by medieval standards. Empires had risen and fallen around it. Armies had marched toward it with certainty and vanished into history. Now it waited again, the first sight. From a distance, the walls looked calm, solid, patient. Sunlight reflected off pale stone, making the city seem almost holy, untouched by the suffering that surrounded it. Towers rose like sentinels, their shadows stretching across the dry earth. Some men whispered prayers. Others felt fear crawl into their stomachs. This city did not look afraid. It looked prepared. Jerusalem as a character. Jerusalem was not just stone and mortar. It was terrain. It was memory. It was belief made physical. The city sat high, surrounded by dry valleys and rocky slopes that offered little cover. There were no forests to hide an approach, no rivers to supply water, no fertile land to sustain a long siege. Every advantage favored the defenders. Jerusalem did not need to attack. It only needed to wait. The defenders revealed themselves. Inside the walls, the Fatimid garrison had already prepared. They had reinforced gates, stockpiled food, poisoned wells outside the city. They knew siege warfare. They knew that hunger, thirst, and time were deadlier than swords. From the battlements, archers watched the Crusader camps form, studying their movements, counting their numbers, noting their weakness. To the defenders, the enemy looked thin, tired, breakable. The crushing reality of thirst. The Crusaders quickly realized a terrifying truth. There was no water. Streams had dried. Wells were unusable. Springs were guarded or contaminated. Men walked for miles under the sun, searching for moisture, and returned with nothing. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, urine darkened, strength faded. Horses, already weakened, collapsed and died. Their bodies left to rot because there was no strength left to bury them. The city had not lifted a weapon, and already it was killing them. The camps of desperation. Crusader camps spread unevenly around Jerusalem, more necessity than strategy. There was no unity in placement, no perfect ring of siege, only clusters of men seeking shade where little existed. Tents flapped in hot wind. Armor lay unused because wearing it drained precious water from the body. The smell of sweat, sickness, and decay hung heavy. At night, the city's torches burned steadily. Inside the walls, life continued. Outside, survival became uncertain. Religious overload. Jerusalem was not just a military objective. It was the center of belief. And belief under pressure can become dangerous. Men knelt for hours in prayer, begging for signs. Priests argued over scripture. Some claimed God would deliver the city without effort. Others warned that failure meant divine judgment. Faith intensified. So did fear. Some men began to see meaning in everything: a bird's flight, a sudden wind, a cloud shaped like a cross. When suffering has no explanation, the mind invents one. First assaults, a shock to the soul. The commanders knew delay favored the defenders. So they attacked, poorly. Rams were dragged toward the gates under blistering sun. Ladders were raised against walls too high. Archers loosed arrows that barely reached the battlements. The response was immediate and brutal. Stones crashed down. Arrows darkened the sky. Fire followed. Men screamed and fell. The walls did not crack. The gates did not yield. Jerusalem absorbed the assault without effort. The men retreated, shocked, not just by defeat, but by how easy it had been for the city to repel them. Jerusalem speaks without words. No message was sent from the walls. No challenge issued. Jerusalem did not need to speak. Its message was clear. You are weak. You are exposed. You do not belong here. That silence was more frightening than insults. The city at night. At night the contrast deepened. Inside Jerusalem, lamps glowed. Food was cooked. Water was rationed but available. Outside, men lay awake listening to thirst scratch their throats raw. Some dreamed of fountains, others of rivers. Many woke screaming. The city loomed above them, unchanged, as if time itself favored it. Commanders under pressure. Leadership strained. Godfrey of Bouillon walked the camps, silent, knowing that confidence had to be shown even when none remained. Raymond of Toulouse clashed with other leaders, arguing over strategy, placement, and blame. Unity frayed. Jerusalem did not exploit these divisions. It did not need to. The psychological siege. The defenders understood something vital. They did not need to win battles. They needed to break minds. From the walls they shouted insults, displayed severed heads, mocked prayers. It was deliberate. They wanted despair to spread faster than disease, and it worked. When faith begins to twist, as hope thinned, faith changed shape. Some men believed Jerusalem would only fall if they proved worthy. Others believed suffering itself was the test. Barefoot processions were proposed, public penance encouraged, hunger accepted as purification. The line between devotion and desperation blurred, and Jerusalem watched. Jerusalem as memory. Every stone carried history. Romans, Byzantines, caliphs. Jerusalem had been taken before. It remembered. And now it waited to see if these men, ragged, starving, fractured, would become another forgotten army scattered beneath its walls. The second failed attempt. Another assault followed. Another failure. The walls stood unbroken. The men retreated again, slower this time. Something changed in their eyes. They were no longer asking how to take the city. They were asking if they could. The city tightens its grip. Days passed. The sun burned. Men died quietly now, not in battle, but in shade, alone. Jerusalem did nothing, and that was the cruelest act of all. Narration. Jerusalem had revealed itself, not as a prize, not as a promise, but as an enemy that did not rush, did not rage, did not fear, an enemy that understood time. And as the days dragged on, the men outside its walls began to understand a terrifying truth. The city was not waiting for them to conquer it. It was waiting for them to break. There comes a point in every siege when time stops behaving as it should. Days no longer feel separate. Nights blur together. Hunger dulls thought. Thirst reshapes memory. Outside Jerusalem, that moment arrived quietly. Not with a battle, not with a cry, but with silence. The body begins to fail. Hunger is not immediate. At first it is manageable. A tightening in the stomach, a weakness in the limbs. Then it changes. The body begins to consume itself. Muscle shrinks. Vision blurs. Thoughts slow. Men struggle to remember names, sometimes even their own. Thirst is worse. Lips split and bleed. Tongues swell. Voices crack into whispers. Urine becomes dark, then stops altogether. Some men drank whatever they could find. Muddy puddles, stagnant pools, moisture scraped from stone. Many died from it. Jerusalem had still not lifted a sword. The camps become graveyards. Bodies appeared in tents at dawn. Men who had lain down and never risen. There were no funerals now. No prayers spoken aloud. The living barely had the strength to bury the dead. Flies gathered. The smell spread. And still, the city stood above them, clean, distant, unmoved. The mind under siege. As bodies weakened, minds unraveled. Sleep brought no rest. Dreams became cruel. Visions of water, food, home. Men woke screaming. Others woke laughing. Some stared at the walls for hours, unmoving, as if willing them to crumble through sheer focus. Hunger strips away the future. There is only now, and now was unbearable. Faith tightens its grip. In desperation, faith intensified. Priests spoke constantly now. Sermons grew louder, longer, more urgent. They said suffering was purification. They said hunger was proof of devotion. They said God was watching, testing. Men listened, because there was nothing else left to hold on to. Some believed angels would descend and tear the walls apart. Others believed the city would fall the moment they proved worthy. Faith became currency, and doubt became dangerous. Visions and signs. Soon, men began to see things. A cross in the clouds. A voice carried on the wind. A dream that felt more real than waking life. One soldier claimed a saint had spoken to him in the night. Another said Jerusalem trembled beneath his feet. The commanders listened carefully. Belief could inspire, but belief could also destroy what little discipline remained. When discipline begins to die, order collapsed slowly. Men wandered from their posts. Arguments turned violent. Food theft was punished brutally. Some were executed, not for betrayal but for stealing bread. Hunger makes enemies out of brothers. Trust vanished. Even among the faithful. The procession. Then came the procession. Barefoot, fasting, silent. The priests ordered the army to circle Jerusalem in penance, believing God would reward humility. Men walked on bleeding feet beneath the sun, dragging their starved bodies around walls that did not respond. From the battlements, defenders watched in disbelief and amusement. The city did not tremble. The gates did not open. Jerusalem did not care, a city that refuses to answer. The silence was crushing. No sign appeared. No miracle occurred. The men returned to camp weaker than before. Something fragile broke that day. Not faith entirely, but certainty. The edge of madness. In the nights that followed, the camps changed. Laughter echoed where it did not belong. Weeping became constant. Men spoke to shadows. Some believed they were already dead. Others believed death would be a mercy. A few tried to climb the walls alone, mad with thirst, only to be cut down without effort. Jerusalem absorbed them without consequence. Leadership in the dark. Godfrey prayed alone now. Raymond argued bitterly with other commanders. No plan seemed possible. Every option ended in starvation. Every delay favored the city. And still they waited, because they had no choice. When faith turns inward, as hope faded, belief grew harsher. Some men accused others of sin, claiming impurity was why the city would not fall. Punishments followed. Public confessions, whippings, forced fasting. Faith became weaponized, not against the enemy, but against themselves. The lowest point. By now the army was on the edge of collapse. Jerusalem had done what walls and arrows could not. It had hollowed them out. Men no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival or release. And then the sea. And then, when despair had reached its deepest point, something unexpected happened. Word arrived. Ships at the coast. Supplies. Wood. Hope. Not divine intervention. Not angels, but timber and tools. And the possibility, however fragile, of action. A shift in the air. The camp stirred, not with joy, but with movement. Men stood straighter. Commanders spoke with purpose again. Jerusalem had starved them, broken them, nearly erased them, but it had not finished them. Not yet. Hunger had taken their strength. Madness had tested their faith. Jerusalem had nearly claimed their souls. But as the first pieces of wood were dragged toward the camps, a dangerous idea returned. Not belief, not certainty, but resolve. And Jerusalem, silent and ancient, would soon learn that desperation can be more dangerous than faith. Hope did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as wood. Rough beams dragged inland from the coast. Nails scavenged from ships. Ropes frayed by salt and travel. Tools passed from hand to hand like sacred objects. For the first time since Jerusalem came into view, the army could build something. And in that act of construction, something long dormant began to stir. Purpose. The arrival of timber. The ships that reached the coast carried more than supplies. They carried possibility. Wood enough to build towers, iron enough to reinforce them, rope enough to lift men over walls that had mocked them for weeks. Men who had barely stood days earlier now labored from dawn until nightfall. Hands bled, no one complained. This was not faith. This was survival. Jerusalem watches the change from the walls. The defenders noticed immediately. The camps no longer lay still. Shapes rose where nothing had stood before. Frames, wheels, platforms. Jerusalem had fed on delay. Now, delay was ending. The siege becomes real. Until now, Jerusalem had been an idea, a symbol, a test. But as towers took form, the city became something else. A target, commanders gathered. Plans were drawn in dirt. Routes were measured by footsteps. Godfrey of Bouillon oversaw construction personally, understanding that morale was now tied to progress. Raymond of Toulouse focused his forces elsewhere, drawing attention away from the true point of attack. For the first time, the Crusaders were not reacting, they were acting. The labor of the starving. The men who built the siege engines were not strong. They were starved. They worked because there was no alternative. Every beam raised was an act of defiance against the city that had nearly broken them. Every hammer strike echoed with anger. Jerusalem had waited patiently. Now patience was being challenged. Night work and silence construction continued at night. Torches were shielded. Voices were hushed. The city listened, but could not stop what it could not see clearly. Every creak of wood felt dangerously loud. Every shadow seemed to move, yet the work continued. The defenders respond. Jerusalem did not remain passive. From the walls, the defenders launched fire arrows, sent sorties at night to burn unfinished machines. Skirmishes erupted in darkness. Men fought hand to hand among half-built towers and scattered tools. Blood soaked into dust. Sometimes the attackers prevailed. Sometimes they did not. But the machines remained, scarred, burned, repaired, still rising. The weight of anticipation. As days passed, tension replaced despair. No one spoke of hunger now. No one spoke of thirst. Every conversation circled back to the same question. When the towers stood ready, the ladders were reinforced, the rams were aligned. Jerusalem loomed closer now, not emotionally but physically. Men could smell the city. Faith returns. Changed faith did not disappear. It transformed, no longer frantic, no longer desperate. It became quiet. Men prayed not for miracles, but for strength. Some confessed sins, others said nothing at all. Each man faced the coming assault alone, even while surrounded by thousands. The commander's burden. Godfrey knew what would come next. He knew that once the assault began, control would vanish. Sieges end in chaos. Victory and atrocity walk hand in hand. He carried that knowledge silently. Raymond understood it too. No commander could truly command what was coming. Jerusalem feels fear for the first time. The defenders sensed the shift. They could see the towers clearly now. They could hear the preparations. They could feel the inevitability pressing inward. Jerusalem had starved its enemy. Now it would have to face them. Rule the night before. On the final night, the camps were unnaturally quiet. No songs, no laughter. Men checked straps, sharpened blades, touched amulets. Some wrote names into dirt, knowing there would be no graves. Others sat awake until dawn, staring at walls they would soon climb, or die beneath. The city was silent too, as if holding its breath. Dawn approaches. When the sky began to lighten, a sound rippled through the camps. Movement. Orders passed quietly. Men took positions. The siege towers were pushed forward, slowly, painfully, toward walls that had stood for centuries. Jerusalem stood unmoving, waiting. Act off closing. Long silence, then distant drums. Narration. The wood was ready, the iron was set. The men were as prepared as men on the edge of death could be. Jerusalem had tested them with hunger, with silence, with time. Now, at last, the waiting was over. What followed would not be strategy. It would not be faith. It would be violence. History rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with clarity or ceremony. It arrives in noise, in confusion, in fear. On the morning Jerusalem fell, no one standing beneath its walls truly understood what they were about to unleash, only that there was no turning back. The towers begin to move. The siege towers rolled forward at dawn. Slow, heavy, relentless. Men pushed from behind while others clung to the sides, shields raised against arrows that rained down like judgment. The ground shook beneath wooden wheels. From the walls, defenders shouted. Horns sounded, arrows flew. Jerusalem, for the first time, was being forced to respond. At the first contact, when the towers reached the walls, time collapsed. Ladders dropped. Bridges slammed down against stone. Men surged forward, not in formation, not in discipline, but in desperation. Steel met steel, hands grabbed. Bodies fell, some fell screaming, some fell silently. The walls that had resisted weeks of hunger were suddenly alive with motion. Godfrey's breakthrough. At one point along the northern wall, Godfrey of Bouillon's tower reached its mark. The bridge dropped, and a handful of men crossed. Just a few. That was all it took. Defenders fell back under pressure. A foothold was gained. Jerusalem, ancient, patient, unyielding, was breached. When the gates opened, once one wall section broke, everything followed. Gates were forced from within. More men poured in. The city that had watched in silence for weeks now echoed with chaos. Shouts in many languages filled the streets. Smoke rose. The siege was over. The sack had begun. Control is lost. No commander controlled what followed. Not Godfrey, not Raymond, not anyone. Men who had starved, suffered, and nearly died now found themselves inside the city they believed God had promised them. Restraint vanished. Fear turned outward. Vengeance followed. The streets of Jerusalem. The streets became rivers of panic. Defenders fled, civilians hid. Doors were barred and broken. Some begged, some fought. Many simply ran. The Crusaders moved forward in waves, some driven by fury, others by terror, others by something colder and quieter. Jerusalem was no longer an enemy. It was a victim. Faith and violence entwined. Men shouted prayers as they struck. Others shouted nothing at all. Some believed they were instruments of divine will. Others no longer thought in words. Faith did not guide the violence. It justified it afterward. These sacred spaces, violated holy places, revered by many faiths, were not spared. The Temple Mount echoed with screams, blood-soaked stone that had witnessed centuries of devotion. The city that had been fought over for eternity now bore fresh scars. History would remember this day, not kindly. Those who survived, some survived by hiding, others by surrender, a few by chance. Many did not survive at all. There was no order to who lived and who died. Only momentum, only exhaustion, only the terrible weight of unleashed humanity. When the killing ends eventually, even rage tires, even violence slows. As night fell, Jerusalem grew quieter. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Fires burned low. Men sat in silence, surrounded by what they had done. Victory had been achieved, but it felt nothing like they imagined. The morning after dawn revealed the cost. The streets were unrecognizable. The cities stood, conquered, scarred, forever changed. Men walked through Jerusalem not as pilgrims, but as survivors of something they could not yet name. Some wept, some prayed, some stared at their hands. Godfrey refuses a crown. When offered kingship, Godfrey of Bouillon refused to wear a crown of gold. He chose a simpler title, Protector of the Holy Sepulchre. Even he understood, somewhere deep, that no crown could sit comfortably on a day like this. What Jerusalem took, Jerusalem was taken. But it also took something in return. It took innocence, if any remained. It took certainty. It took the idea that faith alone makes men righteous. Those who survived carried the city with them forever, in memory, in silence, in regret. History steps back from a distance, historians would argue. Strategists would analyze. Theologians would debate meaning. But those who were there remembered something else. The smell, the sound, the moment when victory stopped feeling holy. Active closing, final reflection, narration, slow quiet. Jerusalem fell in fire and steel. The road to it was paved with suffering. Its walls were broken by hunger and resolve. Its streets were claimed in blood. And when the dust settled, history did not ask who was right. It only recorded that men, certain of their cause, had done what men have always done, when belief, fear, and power collide. Jerusalem endured, but no one who took it left unchanged.